I lead the construction team, and Diana is a senior associate. So between the two of us today, we are going to take you through mainly the different types of construction contracts that you find in the market, as well. Tomorrow, we'll deal with some of the dispute mechanisms and dispute avoidance mechanisms. All right, so I'm just going to give you a slight overview of the contents of the 2 days that we'll discuss. So we're going to start with an introduction of the types of construction contracts that you find. Sorry, I think you might not be able to see the slides. Oh, there we go. So we're going to focus on the typical contracts within, firstly, the renewable energy sector, and that's just because at the moment and for the foreseeable future, renewable energy is quite a massive thing within Africa. And there's plenty of projects currently ongoing, but also a lot in the pipeline across the world. And then also the types of contracts that you would find within the general construction sector. We're then going to look at the types of factors that influence your choice of contract. So when you have a client coming to you and you need to advise which one of all of these options is best, we'll take you through some of the factors that need to be considered. And then we're going to look at the structure of the standard form construction contracts. That's just to explain how do you read these contracts, what are the contract documents made up of, and just generally to give you an idea of how to deal with these contracts. And then we're going to look very high level at the risk allocation in terms of each of these contracts. And the risk allocation is quite important because at the end of the day, the manner in which you want to allocate your risk is one of the driving factors in deciding, firstly, what type of contract to use, and secondly, whether you need to make any amendments to the standard form. And then for today, the last one is agency. So the employer's agents, and they have different names depending on which contract you look at. So typically it's referred to a project manager, a principal agent, or an engineer, or an employer's representative. So we're just going to look at what authorities do they have in terms of these contracts, what's their responsibilities, and to what level can there be an interference, specifically by the employer, in how the agents do their jobs. And then tomorrow we're going to move on to claims processes, where we'll take you through both the process for a contract and an employer's claim, how those are determined in terms of the different contracts, and what happens to performance whilst that is ongoing. We're then going to look at an overview of what alternative dispute resolution means, specifically within the construction industry and these types of contracts. We're going to look at the new ideas that have been introduced by FIDIC and NEC, being dispute avoidance mechanisms. And finally, we'll take you through all of the dispute resolution mechanisms under the different contracts and just explain to you the key issues that you need to know about and how do you manage these disputes in terms of those mechanisms. Okay, so we're going to kick off just with the typical contracts in the renewable energy sector, which Diana is going to take you through, and I will then after that deal with the specific construction contracts. I think if anyone has questions throughout, you can just pop them into your box, and we'll have someone to just look at that and answer it. At the end of today's presentation, we will have a Q&A as well. So you're also welcome to leave your questions until then, but we'll try to answer everything at least by the end of the session. Right, Ilham.
Good morning, everyone. So as Lisa Marie said, we'll look at the typical contracts, specifically in the renewable energy and construction sectors. And the first one we'll look at is the EPC contract, which is the engineering, procurement, and construction contract. This is a contract where there's one line of contractual relationship between the owner and the EPC contractor. And the EPC contractor then undertakes the responsibility for detailed designs, the procurement, and the construction. And then as a result of that, all those responsibilities in the EPC contract, most certain sections of the scope of work will then be subcontracted to other subcontractors, such as perhaps the designs, travel, or if there's any transport requirements, things like that will then be subcontracted to other contractors. Obviously, there's then subcontract relationships between the EPC contractor and the subcontractors, which is an advantage to the owner, because it doesn't have the obligation or responsibility to manage those relationships with the different subcontractors. So it is then obviously also clear that the EPC contractor undertakes more obligations and risks as a result of that contract structure. And generally, the contract price will therefore be much higher than one would expect under a normal construction contract. And then just one other point to mention is that as a matter of good practice, usually an EPC contract will reflect all the obligations and risks that underlies the relationship between the employer and the project company. So, for example, if I can use a renewable energy project, if there's a power purchase agreement between Eskom and the project company, all the risks and obligations that are encapsulated in that contract should ideally be passed down into the EPC contract, as the EPC contractor is in a position to manage some of the obligations that are in the power purchase agreement. And then just to look at some of the advantages or benefits under an EPC contract is that the contractor bears the risk of integrating the performance of all the subcontractors, including the design. The contractor bears the supply chain solvency risk. If there's transfer of other construction risks, that is maximized relative to other procurement methods. There's a high degree of certainty in terms of cost, time, and quality. One big advantage or benefit is the single point of accountability for both design and construction. So if there's any defect in relation to the design and construction, the employer can directly claim against the EPC contractor, irrespective of where that default lies. The administrative burden is minimized because the EPC contractor needs to undertake most of the administrative obligations. EPC procurement is widely used and understood as the most bankable procurement method in our market. Then some of the disadvantages is, as I've mentioned, the cost is usually much higher, so there's a substantial risk premium on price. The contractor controls the detailed design and construction, so the employer has limited influence on that. The quality, as a means to save costs, the contractor may aim to minimum compliance standards. The contractors are generally motivated to make claims to alleviate risk transfer. And then there's also caps on liability, which is a risk in terms of the EPC contractor for the employer. And then if we move on, that's just a diagram to show the structure where the EPC contractor sits underneath the owner. And then the design, well, the project management functionality is separate from that. And then we'll move on to look at the EPCM contract, which is engineering, procurement, and construction management contract. This contract is not that how can I put it? It's not used that often in the South African market. So, but in contrast of the EPC model, the EPCM contract is much more in line with the services contract, where EPC is obviously in line with the construction and design sector. So the EPCM contractor has a duty to ensure compliance in terms of in the engineering part of the project, the procurement part, and then also the construction management part. So in terms of the engineering part, it needs to ensure that there's compliance with the technical and functional specifications of the employer. In relation to procurement, it is responsible to establish contractual arrangements on behalf of the owner with the subcontractors. So the contractual relationships between the employer will be directly between itself and all the different construction contractors that are required, or engineering consultants that are required for purposes of executing the project. And then lastly, the EPCM contractor will also supervise and manage the construction interface of the project. Okay. And then it's a common practice to structure the EPCM model on the basis of a cost reimbursable fee structure plus a fixed fee. Okay, then just quickly looking at the benefits. So if an EPCM contract works well, it is known to be the lowest cost method because the risk contingency may not need to be utilized. In terms of time, if it works well, it's also the faster procurement method. In terms of market access, the smaller size of individual packages diversifies the pool of bidders. So there will be smaller bidders in relation to the different packages or scope of work that's required for the project. Control and flexibility. Design changes can be accommodated with potentially less cost and delay. And then insolvency and performance failure risk are spread across all the different subcontractors that will be appointed by the employer. The disadvantages, there are more risk that's being retained by the owner, specifically in relation to interface claims between the different contractors that are employed by the owner. The owner's legal remedies are diluted due to the allocation of fault between the different contractors, so that can be very challenging. The reduced values of remedies, limited rights against the EPCM contractor. Then financing options are also limited in respect of the EPCM contract. I know from a bankability perspective, it's not a very favorable contract structure. It also includes complex contract documentation and the management thereof. Significant amounts are placed on the owner's skills and resources to ensure the compliance in terms of and the management of the relationships between the employer and the contractors that are appointed by the employer. And this is a diagram to show the structure that you find in terms of the EPCM contract. Okay, and then we'll move on to an operation and maintenance agreement. Operation and maintenance agreements are often used on projects in the energy sector. That's where there's a relationship between the project company and a professional management company to manage, operate, and maintain the project or the facility. The owning agreements will fill a similar role in the operations phase of the project as an EPC contract would serve in the construction phase. And as you probably already know, is that there's not any standard form of owning agreement that are generally used in the South African market. The O&M contract is also one of the key contracts in any project finance transaction. as it has a significant impact on the success of the project. And this is because if there's a failure to operate and maintain, then as you can imagine, it will definitely have a direct impact on the anticipated revenues of the project. It will also jeopardize the project's company's ability to meet its debt service obligation to the lenders. As a result, result in the project company incurring liabilities under other agreements it may have with third parties, including any concession contract or offtake agreement. And it can cause the value of the project assets to depreciate.
Okay, so we're going to move on to the construction contracts, which is more widely used across most of the sectors. In South Africa specifically, they are used by government, they are used on infrastructure and building projects. And before we look at the standard forms, I want to take you through the different pricing regimes that we find under these construction contracts. And as I said previously, depending on what stage the project is at when you tender for a contractor to start the works, or depending on variables that you anticipate, depending on how much certainty or uncertainty the employer has or wants to have, a different pricing regime is chosen. And some of the standard forms are better with certain of these pricing regimes, while others are better with other pricing regimes. So just very quickly, you get lump sum contracts, ad measurement contracts, you get cost contracts, which can be cost reimbursable or cost plus, and you get target contracts. So let's break all of these down just to give you a better idea of what does all of this mean. So in terms of a lump sum contract, a single lump sum price will be quoted for the completion of specific work to the satisfaction of employer and by a specific date. So the use of this type of strategy implies that the design is finalized, it's accepted by the employer, or where the contractor is responsible for both design and construction. There's very much certainty as to what specifically the work entails. So although the contract is usually awarded on the basis of a single lump sum price, in all the projects except for the smaller type projects, in practice, it is usual that payment of a proportion of the lump sum will be made to the contractor on completion of a predetermined stage of work, or as we call it, milestone payments. So once you reach a certain stage of the work or a certain milestone, a certain amount is paid out. And that's kind of then based on an estimate of what the value of that portion of the work would be at that stage. So while conventional construction contracts imply that the contractor carries a significant amount of risk, in extreme cases, lump sum contracts may require the contractor to carry, in fact, all of the risk, including the risks of unexpected events. The consequence of this is that the contractor will likely have to price a lot higher in order to make provision for those types of risks. And if they don't in fact materialize, it might result in the employer paying more than he would have had he gone with a different type of pricing regime, or have assumed those risks himself. The advantages are that the main advantage is that the employer enjoys a high degree of certainty about the final price. A lump sum contract also encourages keen pricing. It allows for easy contract management as long as there are few changes. So just understand that a lump sum contract does not mean that where there's a change to the scope of work, that you still just get the amount that was quoted up front. There's still the mechanisms within these contracts to make changes to the value of the work. The disadvantages is that the lump sum contracting is not suitable when many changes are expected during the execution of a project. The appointed contractor might actually underestimate the risks that he has to assume, which would result in him making a loss. It could lead to cost cutting or spurious claims, and even the potential of liquidation for smaller contractors. And this can be far more costly to an employer than selecting a more expensive tender or tenderer, or another contracting strategy. Finally, the employer and the professional team will have limited opportunity to be involved in the management of the construction. Then when you look at ad measurement contracts, this is where the whole of the work is subject to remeasurement and payment is made for the work that was actually done. And this can be done in one of two ways, either through a bill of quantities or a schedule of rates. So the former is quantity based and the rates can change, whereas the latter is rate based and the rates won't change. So a bill of quantities contract facilitates competitive bidding, while also incorporating a mechanism for the introduction and valuation of changes in the works during the course of the contract, with the bill of quantities then forming part of the contract. The schedule of rates contract expressly excludes any revision of rates, except where the tender sum has been exceeded by a specific percentage. So typically, the schedule of rates contracts would allow for an increase in cost, let's say up to 10 or 15%. Once costs are so inflated, whether it's due to economic reasons or otherwise, over and above the 10 or the 15% that was agreed, the contractor would have an opportunity to revise its schedule of rates. So a bill of quantities contract is the total contract sum, or in terms of that, the total contract sum is the tender sum, which is given in respect of the measure of work, as it's set out in the bill of quantities, whereas the schedule of rates is a contract sum that can only be calculated at the completion of the contract, because that's only when you will know what the actual quantity of the work is. The advantage of using an ad measurement contract is that they are widely used and well understood within the industry. They're very flexible for design and other types of changes within the work. It enhances competitive bidding and tender analysis and comparison, because you can actually compare like for like exactly what is tendered for. And in most disciplines, detailed and comprehensive methods of measurement are well established. The disadvantage, of course, is that an employer has a lot of uncertainty as to what the final price is, because it will only be determined when the construction is complete. Moving on to the cost contracts. So cost reimbursable are used when the requirements of the employer are vague, or when it's necessary for the design to proceed concurrently with the construction, so where you don't yet have your final designs when the works commence, or where the employer wants to be involved in the management of the execution of the contract. It's also desirable to reduce financial risks to the contractor. Cost plus is simply a variation of the cost reimbursable contract. And it involves reimbursing the contractor for all its proved costs incurred in the fulfillment of the contract, plus an agreed fee to cover profits that's calculated either at a percentage of the agreed actual cost or at a fixed monetary amount. So as the contractor is not incentivized by there being no financial risk or return over and above the agreed percentage or the fee, the employer should establish an effective control and implement a proactive management structure when it uses the cost plus contract. The advantages of cost contracts is that they're extremely flexible. there's a fair payment and there's good control of risk, which allows a high level of employee involvement. It facilitates joint planning, and knowledge of actual costs is beneficial to the employer in estimating and controlling and evaluating any proposed changes that the employer might have. The disadvantages is that there's little incentive for the contractor to actually perform efficiently. The employer won't have an idea of what the cost is initially at the commencement of the project. It can only estimate, and the employer and his relevant professional team must understand the nature of the contractor's business in order to ascertain whether this is going to work. Target contracts is where an employer chooses to give certain incentives to a contractor by making provision for, as an example, payment of a bonus to the contractor when it achieves predefined targets in terms of time, cost, or performance. Time or performance targets may be set in any type of contract, such as a lump sum, ad measurement. So the contractor can get a bonus for early completion of the works, for example, or early completion of a certain work package, in addition to what is actually agreed as the contract price. So this, of course, is the type of contract that an employer would choose where he's got time pressures to have a project complete. And he really wants to incentivize the contractor to do to complete as early as possible. So alternatively, the cost targets may be introduced into a cost reimbursable contract to encourage the contractor to work efficiently and economically. In its simplest form, this would involve the contractor receiving, in addition to the reimbursement of actual cost or cost plus a percentage fee, a share of any saving between the target and the actual cost. And so you're basically incentivizing the contractor in a cost type contract to keep the costs as low as possible, and it'll share in any savings. The advantages of using this is that the employer can maintain good control over the risk. Some flexibility is possible. The employer and the contractor have an interest in minimizing the cost. The contract requires an active management role for the employer and his agents, and that enhances transparency. And knowledge of actual cost is beneficial to the employer in estimating, controlling, and evaluating proposed changes. The disadvantages are that it's an unfamiliar administration process. It requires cost consultants or accountants and engineers who understand the nature of these contracts and the contractor's business. The initial target cost provides no greater certainty about the final price than the tender total where you use, for instance, an ad measurement contract. The employer would have no idea of what the initial cost is at the commencement, and it requires the parties to develop an understanding of their new roles, because this is an unfamiliar type arrangement, and the parties retain their traditional or if the parties retain their traditional attitudes, then the necessary collaboration might not be there in order to make this work. And then when we talk about other forms, those are the ones that Diana just talked about, where you have the EPC, EPCM, and the management types contracts. All right, so the construction sector typically uses what we refer to as standard form construction contracts. And generally these include FIDIC, which has got the more popular 1999 version, and the 2017 suite, which is the latest one. You get the NEC3, which is the previous version of NEC, also currently still the more popular option. and NEC4, which is the latest version. JBCC, with the latest version being issued in May 2018, the edition 6.2, and then a GCC 2015. So today we're just going to look at FIDIC, NEC, and JBCC. Those are the ones used most often within the construction industry at the moment. We have seen the GCC still being used often in certain types of work, like bridges and road building. But unfortunately, there's not so much time, so we'll focus on the main ones. All right, so moving over to what the FIDIC suite of contracts look like. So there you can see you start with the question, is this a straightforward project? If the answer is no, you go over to the next question, and that is, will there be an employer design? If the answer is yes, then you use what we call a red book, and that is simply conditions of contract for construction, and it also has a subcontract linked to it. If the employer does not have design responsibility, and that will form the contractor, then we go over to the next question and we ask ourselves, is there going to be a responsibility to bring in plant, and or are there unforeseen risks? Is there a high possibility of unforeseen risks within the project? If the answer is yes, then again we ask further question, okay, so will the contractor be responsible for maintaining the works? If that is no, then you can use the yellow book, which is the conditions of contract for plant and design build. So the contractor has the responsibility to design the project or the works, to bring in the plant, and then to build the project. If there is going to be maintenance, then you would look at an operation contract, such as the gold book, which is conditions of contract for design, build, and operate, which simply means that after the project is completed, the same contractor will then also operate that project on behalf of the owner. And those are the two in terms of contractor design and maintenance. When we go back to the question of whether there's going to be plant or high unforeseen risks, if the answer is no, then we look at further issues like, do we want a fixed price lump sum? Do we want little employer involvement? And obviously, as we said, there's no major unforeseen risks. So if the answer to those types of questions is yes, that's what we want. We want a fixed price. We want little employer involvement. We don't foresee many unforeseen risks. Then you can move to the EPC type contract. So Diana's already discussed that. But within FIDIC, that's called the silver book, and that's the conditions of contract for EPC turnkey projects. And if the answer is no, some of those questions has a no attached to it, then you probably would need more of a bespoke type of contract. And then finally, going back to the very first question, is this a straightforward project? Something small or even bigger, but really basic project, then you can move over to what we call the green book. And that's just a short form of contract, quite unique on its own. Yeah, so that's kind of how you deal with the FIDIC suite when you choose which one. Moving over to the NEC3. Within that, we've got contracts for works, we've got contracts for services, and we've got contracts for supply. In terms of the works contracts, you have what is called the ECC, or the engineering and construction contract. And that can really include any level of design responsibility. You also get the short form of that contract, so the engineering and construction short contract. So this does not require sophisticated management techniques. It comprises straightforward work and imposes only low risks on both the employer and the contractor. Then we get the subcontracts, which is the engineering and construction subcontract. That's used where the contractor has been appointed under the ECC, and it wants to write the subcontract back to back with its main contract, so that there's a flow through of risks, responsibilities, claims, processes, etc. And then you also get the short form of that, which is obviously meant to be read with the short form of the ECC. Moving over to the services, we have the professional services contract and the short form of that. And that is for any of your professional teams that need to be appointed, such as engineers, designers, consultants. And then you have the term services contract with the short form of that. And a term services is really used where a contractor is required to manage and provide a service only for a specific period of time. And obviously the short form, again, it doesn't require sophisticated management techniques. It comprises a straightforward work, and it is low risk for both the employer and the contractor. Finally, the supply contracts. It's just one supply contract in a short form of that. And as you can imagine, that's for local and international procurement of high value goods. So things that cannot appropriately be supplied through something simple like a purchase order or an invoice. So it's for high value goods and related services, and it would include the design of whatever it is that you're procuring. Okay, then moving over to the NEC4. So in terms of the NEC4, there's been a few new contracts or a slight change in how all of these contracts have been put together. Again, you've got your work, your services, your supply, and then we've got the novel NEC4 Alliance contract. So in terms of the work, that remains the same. You've got your ECC, your short form of your ECC together with subcontracts. And these contracts, both the NEC3 and 4, are suitable for purchases. So you can purchase designs, or you can procure for construction, refurbishment, decommissioning of building structures. You can build infrastructure with these contracts. So it's quite a wide variety of what you can do with the ECC contracts. And then the NEC4 Alliance contract is designed for an integrated delivery team. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. And then you've got the design, build, operate contract, which is something new introduced. And that's obviously very similar to your FIDIC contract. Then under the services agreement, there's been a new contract included there, which is the NEC4 Facilities Management Contract, together with its subcontract, as well as the short forms of both of those. And then you still get your term services agreements and your professional services contracts. So these services agreements are obviously suitable for purchase of professional services, as I've already said, and they also cover composite services such as asset management and maintenance. And the facility management agreement is aimed to be used in services such as cleaning, catering, decorating, security, data processing. So it was introduced specifically for that. All right, and then in terms of the supply, we still have the normal supply contract and the supply short contract. And of course, it's still for more high value goods. And and associated services. So typically what you'd see there is things like transformers, generators, rolling stock, cranes, any complex plant. Okay, and then I'm going to spend some time on the alliance contract because it's a novel idea in South Africa. It has been used in Europe for a longer period than it's been used here. And I think if used correctly, it really could be a game changer within the South African construction industry. The industry is quite adverse with contractors and employers being in disputes more often than we'd like. And so the alliance contract is aimed at kind of taking away that the traditional role of employer and contractor, each trying to get as little risk under a contract as possible and as much profit as possible, but move more towards a partnership. So it's a party contract for the appointment of a number of partners to create an alliance to deliver a project within time. So contracting as an alliance offers a different approach, more collaborative working between what's called the client and the suppliers compared to the other types of contracts that we just talked about. It's suitable to clients who wish to enter into longer term collaborative relationships with a number of suppliers in order to deliver a large scale multidiscipline project. And it is effectively a design and build form contract. It's intended for delivery of long-term complex infrastructure programs where the volume of work justifies full investment from the client in the processes and fostering long-term relationships necessary to deliver a successful project. So the basis of the contract is, as I said, that all the parties work together in achieving what's called the client's objectives. And in doing so, they share in both the risks and the profits or the benefits. So it's really a true partnership. So the potential benefit of using this contract is that there would be a much deeper collaboration between all the suppliers, including the consultants, the contractors, because they would be bound by a common interest. And hopefully that reduces grounds for disputes. Now, there are four main parties, if you want to call it that, in terms of the alliance contract. The first is you have your client, who has a number of duties that's typically associated with an employer, as you would see under the other forms of contract. And so the employer has to select the members of the alliance. It has to set out the alliance objectives, the initial scope, the client requirements, the performance table. And it will have to review its selection criteria to ensure that adequate weight is given to all of these aspects and to bids that demonstrate a collaborative aptitude to making alliancing a success. Then you have what's called the alliance board, and this consists of the partners, the alliance partners, who are individual members of the alliance plus the client. So the alliance board sets the strategy, they allocate work, they appoint the alliance manager, they make decisions, and they are also the first point of referral for disputes. All alliance board members have an equal voice and voting rights, and so the employer or the client doesn't have more than any of the partners. The alliance manager is equivalent to a project manager, and he basically manages the alliance in accordance with the contract and the implementation plan, and he must obey the instructions from the alliance board and the client. And then finally, you have what is called the alliance delivery team. And this is just a team that delivers the work of the alliance. So this consists of the client and each individual partner, which could be a combination of civil contractors, designers, equipment suppliers, effectively all the tier one supply chain, everyone that's part of a tier one supply chain. So delivering the project in accordance with the scope remains a central obligation in terms of the alliance contract. And this is in alignment with all of the other NEC contracts. The other main responsibility of alliance members are that they have to collaborate with each other to achieve the alliance objectives. They have to collaborate to support the delivery of the contract on a best for project basis. So that's the common goal, is what is the best for the project. They have to develop and use common systems and processes, and these are typically set out in the implementation plan. They have to give advice, information, opinions openly and objectively to the Alliance board, so it's very transparent. And it's also shared with other members of the Alliance when asked to do so by the Alliance board. And finally, it's to establish an integrated Alliance delivery team based on a best for project basis and the support of sharing knowledge, information, and best practice. Right. Moving over to the JBCC, you've got your principal building agreement or the PBA, the minor works agreement, and then you have subcontract agreement, which reads with the PBA. And so the principal building agreement is typically used for building work, either by a main or a direct contractor. And the minor works agreement is used for very simple, smaller projects. In terms of the subcontract agreement, the JBCC is quite unique in how it deals with its subcontractors. And it has two types. It's either a nominated subcontractor or a selected subcontractor. So a nominated subcontractor is nominated by the employer or its principal agents for appointment by the contractor. So that's quite important. There's no relationship between the employer and the contractor, irrespective of the fact that the employer has nominated this contractor. But the contractor can take part in the tender process, and it may make reasonable objections against the appointment of any subcontractor that's nominated by the employer. Selected subcontractors is actually selected by the employer or its principal agent, together or in consultation with the contractor, and the contractor will remain the one that goes through the tenders to find a suitable contractor. But essentially, when choosing the successful tenderer, that will happen in consultation with the employer or the PA. So the contractor is entitled to terminate a selected subcontractor's appointment for default of the material term. But when exercising this right in relation to a nominated subcontractor, it will be subject to the employer or the principal agent's instructions. Additionally, where the employer takes the risk in relation to termination of a nominated subcontractor, the contractor will take the risk in relation to termination of a selected subcontractor, unless the selected subcontractor's default is attributable to the employer or its agent. And as I said, there are no contractual rights or obligations directly between the employer or any subcontractor appointed in terms of the JBCC. Okay. So we can move over to what factors is considered when choosing a contract.
So I think one of the main questions employers ask themselves is what to look at when they need to decide on the contract and the structure of a contract. So inevitably, the employer would want the project to be finalized as quickly as possible on a cost-sensitive basis. So incentive is one of the factors that needs to be considered. So the contractor must be incentivized to perform the works efficiently and effectively. And in order for the contractor to do so, the employer must be incentivized to provide the necessary support and information that the contractor requires to deliver. The other factor that's important is flexibility. So usually or not usually, but it may happen that the employer would want to make changes to the scope of work after tender stage. So therefore, the employer should have the ability to make changes to the scope of work. And as a result of that, there should be a mechanism in the contract that would allow for such a change to occur. And then obviously the contractor should have the ability to claim for any additional costs that it would incur in order to affect those changes. The other factor that needs to be considered is risk allocation. You can imagine that on any project there are a number of risks, and the risk needs to fall on either one of the parties to manage. So the appropriate allocation of risk is key to the implementation of a contract or project. So I think in layman's terms, a risk can be defined as an uncertainty to any of the parties or a lack of predictability. So the approach that parties usually take in terms of risk allocation is to ask yourself who is best placed to deal and manage with the risk. So in asking that question, the following factors have been identified to settle that issue, and that's namely which party controls the risk, can the risk be insured against, and if so, by which party? Is it more efficient for one party to retain the risk? And if the risk materializes, does it affect one party more than the other? So those are the questions one can ask and yourself and consider in deciding what contract structure would be most appropriate for a project. The other general factors that needs to be considered are just the financing method. For example, if there's a project that's financed, then usually the lenders would prefer a structure such as the EPC because there's a single point of responsibility. Other factors are ownership, who the owner would be of the facility or the project. Commercial priorities, the speed, the cost, and the certainty of around the project. Certainty in terms of whether it's going to be successful. Market conditions, the procurement rules, and also the nature of the works.
So we're going to look at the structure of the standard form contract. So all of these contracts are not really simple to read. They have various contract documents that make up each of these contracts. And so I'll take you through FIDIC and the NEC, and Diana will take you through the JBCC just to explain to you how do you actually read these contracts. So in terms of, as we've said, we've got the FIDIC, the NEC, and the JBCC in South Africa. In terms of the FIDIC, I will touch on the key differences between the older FIDIC 99 and the later 2017, and I'll do the same with the NEC 3 versus the NEC 4. But we won't do a detailed analysis and an explanation of each of the terms of these contracts. We'll just rather focus on the basic approach to take when you open up these contracts and you want to understand what they are actually saying, what is required in terms of them. So let's move over to the FIDIC suite. All right, so the FIDIC starts with what's called the general conditions. And that's in terms of 99 version, it's clauses 1 to 20. And the 2017 version has got a few additional clauses attached to it. And so those are really your standard conditions of contract. So when parties decide that they want a FIDIC contract to apply to their relationship, they specify which one of the books will be applicable, and your starting point is always with the general conditions, which is the body and the basis of what's agreed between the parties. However, when you look through these general conditions, you will see that there's a lot of data that's missing. And the reason why it's missing is because it's either party specific or it's project specific, or there's another reason why you just can't standardize it. And so a lot of these clauses will have what we refer to as the appendix to tender. And if you have your standard form FIDIC suite of contracts, you'll see at the back of the contract there is a template for the appendix to tender, and that really sets out the relevant clause in the general conditions together with the type of data that's required to be included by the parties based on their specific requirements. So within the appendix to tender, you'll find many things, but most importantly, you'll have the parties' details. So who's the employer, who's the contractor, who's the engineer. It'll set out what the governing law must be. It will set out what the time for completion is, which is obviously key to all construction contracts. And the time for completion can really be set out as a fixed date, or it can be a certain amount of weeks or a certain amount of months from a fixed date. And then it'll set out what the LDs are, so the liquidated delay damages that the employer is entitled to claim if a contractor is late with the work. Again, how you phrase and how you estimate your delay damages is up to each employer. So some do a daily rate, some do a weekly rate. And that's then calculated from the time from the time for completion. So when the contract had to be, or the project had to be completed until the date on which it is actually completed. The appendix to tender will also set out your amounts for securities. So typically you would have, if there was an advance payment, you would have an advance payment guarantee. So the appendix to tender would stipulate what is the amount that we need to provide for. It will set out the amount for the performance guarantee. Again, these can be fixed amounts. It can be a percentage of the value of the contract. And it'll say whether there's a requirement for something like a parent company guarantee or anything other than that, together with the amounts that need to be secured. Also very important is limitations of liability. So there are, within the FIDIC regime, there are plenty of things where either the contractor or the employer or both of their liabilities are limited, either in terms of an amount or in terms of what types of damages can be claimed or what types of claims can be made. In the appendix to tender, you would have values of limitations on liability by the contractor and by the employer in terms of these various clauses. You will also have very specific payment terms. So the appendix to tender will set out, for instance, how often do you need to issue payment certificates if it's different from the standard form, but also what is the interest rate for late payments and all sorts of payment terms that is linked to the actual general conditions, the payment terms under the general conditions. Then you have what is called the employer's requirements. And this is really a very detailed document that is prepared by the employer's technical team. And it sets out all the necessary data for technical requirements. So it's also read with the general conditions, and it basically sets out the scope of the work, the specifications against which the work should be provided, if there's design responsibility, the specifications for the designs. It sets out exactly what is the quality or the lifespan or the warranties expected from the contractor. So the employer's requirements can be a very technical document, and typically people glance over it because they believe it's just the technical stuff and you only look at it when you really need to as a lawyer. But often within the employer's requirements, there are duties, obligations placed on the contractor that's not specified in the actual general conditions or the appendix to tender. So it is important when you do read your FIDIC contracts that you still go through the employer's requirements and make sure what the additional contractor's obligations are. Then you have what is called particular conditions, and those are bespoke clauses which you draft. And that is, the aim of that is to either include additional general conditions or to change any of the general conditions or to take out any of the general conditions. So as an example, if you don't want there to be an engineer's determination under 3.5, which you won't do, but if you do, you will say delete clause 3.5, and that will be your particular condition as you draft it, or you would say replace XYZ portion of paragraph 1 of 3.5 with the following, and then you'll draft what you want to replace it with. Or you can say delete the entirety of 3.5 and replace it with the following, and then you draft your own 3.5. So the particular conditions is really where parties look at what they need to change, and I specifically use the word need to change for the contract to work for their project and for their relationship. So the aim is really not to use your particular conditions to just go on a tangent and draft your own new contract because you don't like the risk allocation. If that's what you are doing and your particular conditions become longer than your actual general conditions, then you should try to at least choose another type contract that's maybe more relevant for your purposes. So the particular conditions is really provided to include project-specific and jurisdiction-specific provisions into your contract. So as an example, in South Africa, where we know we have construction mafia as a major risk, which is probably unique to South Africa, you would use your particular conditions to allocate the risk of construction mafia appropriately. And then you've got some templates or sample forms at the back of your FIDIC, which you can or can't or don't have to use. It's up to you. So it provides for a contract agreement, which is basically a letter of intent when you know that you're going to conclude this agreement based on the FIDIC. You've got a letter of tender to let a successful tenderer know that they've been successful and that the specific FIDIC suite will be used. Then you have a dispute adjudication agreement, which works well with the specific DAB process that is provided for in all of the FIDIC contracts. And that's an agreement that the parties have with the adjudicator. And then you also have a dispute adjudication board agreement that can be used. So those are all of the documents that typically make out a FIDIC contract. And FIDIC does provide for a priority of documents, so it's important that you look at, before reading all of these contract documents, you look at whether that priority of documents have been changed, or if not, you need to understand what the priority of documents is, so that where there might be any conflict in how you read these together, you at least know that some of these documents will take priority over others. In terms of the Green Book, it looks slightly different from the other books because it's a short form and it is its own kind of unique type of book for less complex work. There you have what is called the agreement, and that's upfront setting out the specific project data as you would have as part of the appendix to tender. Then you will have your general conditions, which is a very short form of general conditions. And if you do want to use it, there is a set of rules for adjudication, and there's a template adjudication agreement that can be used. Okay, then the White Book is also slightly different from the rest. So you'll see that we're not really dealing with the White Book in most of the session because it's a professional services contract and we wanted to focus more on construction works. But I do want to just explain to you how the White Book structure works. So there you also have what is called the form of agreement, which is basically your contract data. You then have particular conditions, and your particular conditions has got references to clauses in the general conditions. It's got your additional clauses as with the previous contract. And then it has specific appendices, which deals with the scope of services. It deals with personnel, equipment, facilities, services, and anything else that needs to be provided by the client. It has a specific regime for remuneration and payment to the professional. It's got a program, and then it also has some rules for adjudication. And then finally, you've got your general conditions, which then kind of underpins all of these. Okay, then moving on to what we refer to as golden principles of FIDIC, and this is very important when using your FIDIC document. As I've said previously, using the particular conditions is not aimed at changing the manner in which a FIDIC contract is structured. Each of these contracts are very much structured around certain types of risks that's being allocated for a specific reason. And once you start fiddling too much with the general conditions, you might end up with a contract that no longer looks like the FIDIC that you chose. And we often, especially in government, see FIDIC being used as a baseline for bespoke contracts. And it becomes a copy and paste exercise, and it's butchered with all sorts of particular conditions. And once you start reading it, it just doesn't make any sense, or how the risk allocation has been changed just doesn't work, or the manner in which FIDIC is drafted to really have all of these clauses talk to one another properly is just not there anymore. And you then end up with a contract that has various clauses that just becomes unenforceable, or even more concerning, doesn't really set out what the parties intended. So FIDIC has what they call their golden principles. And the importance of the golden principles is when you start drafting for a client in terms of the FIDIC contract, always look at the golden principles and make sure you comply with those. If you comply with those, then your FIDIC will read well. So there are 5 golden principles. The first is that the duties, the rights, obligations, roles, and responsibilities of the contract parties must be generally as it is implied in general conditions, and then changed appropriately to the requirements of the project. The particular conditions must be drafted clearly and unambiguously. So if you do undertake to change anything or to add, you need to be sure that your drafting is proper, it's unambiguous, it's clear, and it's not open to critique or interpretation in manners that the parties didn't anticipate. The particular conditions should not change the balance of the risk or reward as is provided for in the general conditions. As I said, you choose the FIDIC because of the regimes that's inside of those contracts. So you look at the contracts and you decide which one you want to use, if you want to use a FIDIC, basically, first and foremost, based on how risk is allocated and how reward is allocated. And so you shouldn't be changing that. If you do find yourself in a position where you need to make plenty of changes to that, it means you're busy with the wrong contract. All the time periods that's specified in the contract for the parties to perform their obligations must be of reasonable duration. So you'll see that in terms of these contracts, there's always some form of a time period within which the party should be doing X, Y, or Z. And for the most part, those are often changed. So for instance, if it allows 14 days payment from receipt of invoice or 28 days, but you require in terms of it, the client requires in terms of the internal policies 90 days, you would change that period, for instance, or there would often be changes to the period within which to notify claims or within which determinations has to be made, things like that. So if you do change those time periods, it's important that it's still reasonable within the market that you're drafting for. And then finally, unless there's a conflict with the governing law of a contract, all the formal disputes must be referred to a DAAB in terms of the 2017 version, which is a Dispute Avoidance Adjudication Board, or to a DAB, being the Dispute Adjudication Board, which is applicable mainly in 1999. And that's just to ensure that there's a binding decision as a condition precedent to arbitration. So where you have a decision by your adjudication board or your DAAB, at least you know it's enforceable in the meantime, even if that issue is taken on arbitration. And so that creates certainty specifically for the contractor, and it ensures a little bit of cash flow, hopefully, where the dispute is about payments. All right, so just going further with the golden principles, I just want to take you through some key considerations that underpin these golden principles. So FIDIC's key considerations are that the terms of the contract are comprehensive and they're fair to both parties, to both the employer and the contractor. The legitimate interests of both contracting parties are appropriately considered and balanced, and the legitimate interest of each party includes the right to enjoy the benefits of the contractual relationship generally recognized as implicit in the general conditions. So obviously these contracts have been updated and drafted and prepared over a number of years. It's been used on so many projects, it's tried and tested. That's basically what it says. Best practice principles are fair and balanced risk reward allocation between the employer and the contractor are put into effect in accordance with the provisions of the general conditions. So really the aim is not for an employer when it uses, for instance, a red book, to just place as much risk on a contractor as possible. If it wants to do that, it should use a silver book. So depending on what you want, there is a book that's appropriate for that, and you need to choose that book rather than try and change the risk reward regime. It's drafted in such a way that no party can take undue advantage of its bargaining power. The contractor or subcontractor is paid adequately and timely in accordance with the contract, which helps maintain cash flow. The employer gets best value for money, and to the extent possible, cooperation and trust between the contracting parties is promoted, and adversarial attitudes are discouraged and should be avoided. The contract provisions are not unnecessarily onerous on either of the parties. They can be practically put into effect. And lastly, disputes are avoided to the extent achievable, especially under the 2017 provisions. They are minimized when they do arise, and they're resolved efficiently. So all of these key considerations are what you're going to get out of a FIDIC contract if you use it in accordance with the golden principles, and if you don't change too much of it. Okay, so moving on to the NEC structure. So the NEC is a beast in its own right. And if you've never read an NEC, it might be quite confusing. So the very first thing that I'll mention is that instead of having clauses 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then 1.1, 2.1, 3.1, the drafters of NEC thought it would make a lot more sense to have clauses 1 to 9, but then when you start referring to the subclauses, it becomes 10, 11, 12, or 21, 22, 23, or 31, 32, 33. So when you do read it and you see clause 1, and all of a sudden after that you see clause 10, don't be alarmed. For reasons unknown to me, that's how it is drafted. So we've got what is called the core clauses, and that's very much the same as general conditions under the FIDIC. So those are your standard clauses. You'll note that the NEC is a much shorter contract because it allows a lot more flexibility in terms of what you want your core clauses to look like, or what you want your general terms to be. So you've got your basically your general terms or contract data in clauses, core clauses 1 to 9, and mainly those deal with just general terms, which is definitions and those types of things. Then you have contractors' responsibilities, you have time, you've got testing and defects, you've got payments, then you have what is called compensation events. Those are basically, it sets out a closed list of events for which a contractor can claim time or money, or for which a contractor can claim for the employer, let's rather say for the employer to decide whether there should be time or money. It then deals with title, with risk and insurance, and finally with termination. So you'll see from that closed list 1 to 9, it doesn't deal comprehensively with all of the things you would expect a construction contract to have. And so that's where the NEC becomes a little bit more complex, because you then move away from the core clauses and you have a section that is called main option clauses. And those are options A to F. Sorry, before I move on to that, under the core clauses, another confusing thing that you would notice if you read the NEC is that some of the clauses are italicized and some of the clauses are just capitalized. So it's important to understand that where a term is capitalized, it's defined in terms of the actual core clause, so that you'll find that under 10, clause 10. And where it's italicized, you'll find the definition in what we call the contract data. And we'll deal with the contract data now. So if you see an italicized term, you know that there's some form of a definition in the contract data. Okay, so then we've got the main option clauses. And these are basically the pricing mechanisms that the NEC uses. And parties need to choose one. So you'll see main option clause A is a price contract with what's called an activity schedule. So that's really just kind of particular milestones. You've got a price contract with a bill of quantities as option B. You've got a target contract with activity schedule, option C, or a target contract with a bill of quantities, option D. E is a cost reimbursable contract, and then F is used for the management contract. So options A and B is lump sum prices that's given for the works as they are described in the activity schedules. And it's either against rates or it's against bills of quantity. The options C and D are target contracts. So we've already kind of discussed what target contracts are. So the parties agree to a target price. In this instance, they agree to a target price for the work. And if the work costs more than what the target price is, the actual costs, then the parties basically share in the losses or the cost overrun in pre-agreed portions. But if the work is completed at a lesser amount than what the target price is, the contractor and employer will equally share in the gain that they've basically made. So it's known as the pain share, gain share mechanism. And that's obviously an incentive type arrangement. Option E, which is the cost reimbursable contract, is where the parties agree the level of the contractor's overhead and profit. And the employer then pays actual costs of the work plus the agreed level of overhead and profit. And as I said, the option F is a management option. So that's where the employer wants to manage most of the pricing of the contract. So when you look at the main option clauses, it doesn't just deal with what type of pricing mechanism I'm using. It also changes some of the general conditions that you see in core clauses. And that is just so that when you choose option A, some of the core clauses will look different from when you choose option C and D. And so what you would do is you would look at your main option clause, you'll identify which of the core clauses have been or are included in those main option portions of the contract, and those ones basically replace the core clauses that you find at the start of a contract. So I know it seems very confusing, but when you start reading it, it does make quite a lot of sense. You then have the secondary option clauses, and as you can see, there are plenty. And these are really clauses that you would probably find most of these as the standard in the FIDIC general conditions. But here, NEC wanted the parties to have the flexibility to decide which of these do they really want and which of these don't they want to use at all. So starting with the most important one is the W clauses. Those are just dispute resolution clauses, and it's referred to W1 and W2. So W2 in South Africa is never used. It's based on UK legislation for adjudications. And so we always just use W1. Very importantly, you have to choose which of these clauses apply. Even if you're in South Africa and you know W2 is not going to apply, you have to choose W1. And we'll deal with where you choose these now. But each and every one of these clauses that you want to apply has to be specified within your contract data. And each of these clauses have their own standard conditions. And so when you read those clauses, they have their own little few clauses that apply, and it needs to be read with the core clauses 1 to 9. Okay, so then we have various X clauses. And most important of these that an employer and a contractor needs to decide whether they want to apply is price adjustment for inflation. What happens when there's a change in law? How do you deal with multiple currency contracts? Do you want there to be a parent company guarantee? Will there be sectional completion? Do you want there to be a bonus for early completion? And that's obviously a bonus to the contractor. Do you want delay damages to apply? Partnering. If you want a more collaborative approach, you will include partnering. Will there be a requirement for the contractor to provide a performance bond? Will there be an advance payment? And how is that going to be dealt with? Do you want a limitation of liability for the contractor's design? Is there going to be any retention applicable? Should there be low performance damages? And that's obviously to the benefit of the employer, where whatever the contractor is building is not performing as it should, for the employer to then charge damages for any losses incurred as a result. General limitation of liability clause, and then key performance indicators. So if you want performance damages, then there must be some key performance indicators. And then you've got the Y clauses. Again, those don't apply in South Africa. It is based on UK legislation. And then you have what we call Z clauses. So the Z clauses is the same as particular conditions in FIDIC. So that is basically a blank table where you include any changes you want to have made, either to your core clauses, to the clauses in whatever main option you chose, and to the clauses in whatever secondary options you chose. Any additional clauses you want to add, any clauses or paragraphs you want to delete. All of that gets put into Z as additional conditions. So the option to choose all of this is set out in what we call contract data. So you will see that the NEC has got contract data part A and contract data part B. So contract data part A sets out the employer's details and the employer's requirements. And then part B sets out the contractor's details and the contractor's requirements. So both of those are equally important. They deal with different sets of things. But it's here where the election is made, which main option is used, and which secondary options are going to be applicable. And then the final portion of all of these contract documents is the works information. Again, that's similar to the employer's requirements under FIDIC. So it sets out the employer's technical requirements and specifications. It's usually a very detailed document describing how, where, against what specifications the work must be done. And it often also sets out further contract obligations, which should be carefully considered as part of the contract. Okay, then I just want to take you through some of the more important provisions in the X clauses that I specifically want to highlight. So in terms of the ECC, you have option X, which is the sectional completion. And it's very important to know when you're considering a contract, any construction contract, whether there is sectional completion or not. Because a contractor's right for payment and all sorts of other things, especially when a contract is terminated, is regulated by the question of whether there's only one completion date or whether there's sectional completion. So it's important to understand whether X5 will apply to ECC. And then the delay damages, again, it's a similar way in which it's calculated for each day or per week until the earlier of completion and the date on which the employer then actually takes over the work. So if delay damages has not been chosen, it's important to know that the employer doesn't have a right to delay damages just because there is a completion date specified and the contractor misses it. So if you are drafting this contract and you omit X7, you might have a very unhappy client at the end of the day, because it means that there won't be a liquidated delay damages amount agreed, and the employer would be entitled only to a normal damages claim that has to be proved in the normal way. So as I said in FIDIC, this is something you find within the general conditions, but it's not the same with the NEC. And then your low performance damages is also important. If the employer wants to have that included, it's important that you specifically include it. In terms of the term services contract, it's a little bit of a different contract. And so the option clauses become quite important in terms of how you want your term services contract to work. So generally, what is allowed for is that there's a specific service period within which the work will be done. And once the service period expires, the contract expires, and that's the end of it. However, the service period can be extended through mechanisms in the contract. And when it does, it's important to know whether or not the task order regime in terms of option X19, which you won't find on that table, whether option X19 was chosen or not. So X19 is the task order regime, and that basically says, in addition to the services that is set out in the term services contract, general services that I'm going to provide, the employer can also issue task orders for very specific services to be rendered on an ad hoc basis. So it's important to understand when you're dealing with a term services contract, whether there is this task order regime or not, Because if there is a task order regime, it means that every single task order that was issued to the contractor also now becomes part of the contract. And each task order might have their own additional terms and conditions that must be read, must be understood. It'll have its own scope of services. It'll have its own time period within which it must have been completed. It will include its own delay damages if it's applicable. So the task order, as envisaged under the NEC, it's going to be a very specific, basically contract document on its own. So it's important to understand that where you have a task or services that was required under a task order, the conditions that apply to those will take precedence over the other conditions that the parties have chosen, such as time for completion, delay damages, scope of services, etc. So in terms of X19, X19.1 provides that a task order's work within the service, which the service manager instructs the contractor to carry out, and the task completion will then be when the contractor has done all of the work in the task and has corrected the defects of that task. In terms of X19.2, the service manager consults the contractor about the contents of the task order before he issues it. And then a task order is to be completed on or before the task completion date. Where there's late completion, the contractor pays the delay damages at the rate stated in the task order. So that's X19.3 and X19.4. And then there's prices for items in the task price list, which are not taken from the price list under the general conditions, but they are assessed in the same way as compensation events are assessed under clause 6 of the general conditions. Once a task order is issued, the contractor has to submit a program for acceptance by the service manager. And then from the starting date until the end date of the service period, the contractor reports to the service manager his performance against each of the key performance indicators on task orders as well as the normal key performance indicators that you have under X20. All right, so I just wanted to highlight that because that is something that's unique to the term services contract and that you should be aware of when you do read these contracts and try to ascertain the merits of a client's claims, or if you yourself have to advise the client on how to draft these things. Okay, so we can move over to the structure of the JBCC. Oh, sorry, I think I forgot NEC4. Yeah, sorry. So the NEC4 structure, there's not much difference in how the structure works. It still has the contract data A and B. It still has the core clauses, although they are not exactly the same as the NEC3. So there are a few different headings, and some of the clauses have been changed, the content of the clauses. And then you still have the same W clauses. For the most part, the secondary options remain the same, and all the rest remain the same. So the only thing that you really need to know about the structure of the NEC4 is that there is a slight difference in the content of how the clauses have been drafted. Okay, so
the JBCC Principal Building Agreement is what we'll look at next. I think this is probably an agreement that is familiar to most of us that practices in the construction industry. So the Principal Building Agreement is a document that has been published by the Joint Building Contract Committee. And as you know, they have a suite of standard construction documents available to use for construction projects. From our experience, the JPCC Principal Building Agreement is often used on commercial projects, and it is it's not as complex as the FIDIC and the NEC standard form contracts. So the structure of the Principal Building Agreement is as follows. So it contains the main provision, the general provisions of contract. Then it is the contract data that incorporates the specific requirements of the employer and the contractor. The general preliminaries that generally covers all aspects of preliminaries for most type of projects. It also includes the JBCC nominated and selected subcontract agreement, which replicates and is basically a pass down of the provisions of the JBCC Principal Building Agreement. And then there are also a comprehensive set of certificates that forms part of the suite of JBCC contracts and can be used with the JBCC Principal Building Agreement in order to administer the project. So then just to look at what specific provisions or terms are covered in the general conditions of the JBCC Principal Building Agreement. As you would know, it would always include a section that deals with definitions so that everyone is clear and there's no ambiguity as to what specific terms mean. It will always include a clause that deals with the governing law, the documents that are applicable and the management of the documents, the employer's agents and their responsibilities and design responsibilities. Then there will be a section that deals with insurance obligations and requirements, securities such as any bonds that would be required by the employer or the contractor. We will look at that in a moment. And then the section that deals with execution is basically the general obligations of the employer and the contractor under the contract. The completion section deals with all the requirements in terms of what constitutes the completion regime under the JBCC Principal Building Agreement and how certificates are issued in order to achieve this completion regime. And then it has a section that deals with the rights to suspend the works by the contractor and also the termination provisions that sets out the grounds that entitles either the employer or the contractor to terminate. Dispute resolution, and then agreement, that's the details of the contract, that sets out the details of the contracting parties. For me, most importantly is the contract data, and that lists all the project-specific information. We will go through that in detail because from my experience, it often happens that the parties fail to complete the contract data with simply missing from the main agreement, which really complicates the management of the project as a whole. So if you look at the contract data, the first section requires details of the project information. So there will be a section that you need to complete in terms of the work description. So there you would generally find details of the scope of work. Then the site specifics. I don't think in terms of commercial projects that should generally be an issue, but sometimes the allocation of the site can create complexities in terms of access to the site where it's in a very remote area. Employer's details, the principal agent, we will look at the details around what the principal agent's responsibilities and obligation is in a moment. But most important, the principal agent's details needs to be in there because that's the party that will have the authority to act in terms of the employer under the terms of the contract. And then The contract data also requires the parties to provide the details of all the agents that will be involved in the project, such as mechanical engineers, architects, quantity surveyors. And it may be that there are some authorities delegated to some of those agents because they are focusing on a specialized scope of the work. Then section B deals with contract information, and the first deals with the bills of quantities, and the parties need to agree on what the method of measurement will be. So if there's a variation, the parties should usually then rely on that measurement method to quantify the value of the variation. In law, the applicable law to the works offer an acceptance. The parties need to agree on the currency that will be applicable. Documents is the next section. So there the parties need to agree on the number of copies of the construction information that will be issued to the contractor, and whether the original signed agreement is to be held by the principal agent, and if not, by who that will be held. And under the documents, for me, the most important thing is the list of documents that will comprise the agreement. So it already sets out that the JBCC principal building agreement with the main terms will be the first document. The second document is the contract data that includes the employer and contractor's specific requirements, and then the JBCC general preliminaries. Although there are a section that in the contract data that provides for specific conditions, it's usually quite helpful if the parties also just highlights that there are specific conditions that needs to be looked at and read with in conjunction with the main terms of the agreement. And then in the second table, the parties need to set out the contract drawings. Employers' agents, like I mentioned a moment ago, so there might be agents that have certain authorities that are delegated to them. That is extremely important because they might then have the ability or the authority to give instructions in relation to the scope of work that relates to their area of speciality. Insurances is the next table that you would find in the contract data, where it sets out the type of insurances the parties need to procure and maintain throughout the duration of the project, such as the contract works insurance and public liability insurance, lateral support insurance, and whether, if that's applicable, who will be required to procure that insurance. Then the obligations of the employer will be set out in relation to, for example, whether there will be any other contractors that's going to be on site, if there's going to be any restrictions in terms of the working hours, natural features and known services to be preserved by the contractor, if there will be any restrictions to the site and access to the site. The supply of the issue material is also required to be indicated then. Then there's a list of whether there would be any nominated subcontractors applicable to the project, any direct contractors and the extent of the work that they will be performing. If there is any sections to the project, that should be indicated, and that's where the sectional completion regime becomes applicable. And then the next table deals with the possession of the site, when the contractor will be granted possession of the site, when practical completion is required to be achieved, and the amount of penalties that would be applicable. Usually it's a penalty amount per calendar day. Should the contractor fail to achieve completion. What we've also seen from our experience is that the parties sometimes put in a penalty amount per calendar day for the works as a whole, but they fail to give a penalty amount where there's sectional completion regime applicable. So that's just something to highlight to your client when you assisting to complete the contract data. This is also important is the criteria to achieve practical completion. There's a table that specifically requires the parties to agree on the criteria that needs to be achieved for purposes of achieving practical completion, because that's generally a point for dispute between the parties. Payment regime, so the parties need to agree on how regularly payment certificates will be issued, if there's going to be cost fluctuations, and the method that will apply. The next table in the contract data deals with dispute resolution. There the parties need to agree on the name of the nominating body, the rules that will be applicable for adjudication, if an arbitration is to proceed, what the nominating body for that would be, and also the rules that will be applicable to the arbitration proceedings. Then there's a section that deals with the details of general preliminaries. I'm not going to go into too much detail about that, but that should be completed between the parties and agreed. And then lastly is the changes to be made to the JBCC documentation. So that's where the parties will provide for any amendments to the general conditions of the principal building agreement. The last or the next section is section C, that deals with the tender closing. So there the parties or the employer needs to set out the date by when the tender will close, and the address where the tenders needs to be submitted. The tender selections, securities, guarantee for construction. So the parties must indicate, or the employer at least, whether it requires a guarantee for construction and whether it needs to be a variable construction guarantee or a fixed guarantee. And then there could also be an option for guarantee for payment by the employer if the contractor requires an advance payment guarantee. A guarantee for payment. We don't often see that that's a requirement. I think in the current economic environment, contractors are quite desperate for work and would not necessarily demand the employers to provide them with a payment guarantee. Then, as I've mentioned, the advance payment guarantee can also be applicable if the contractor requires the employer to provide an advance payment for purposes of procuring any materials or equipment that might be required for performing the works. Then the tender selection section sets out a table where the annual holidays will be indicated. So that period will not apply to, for example, where the parties agree on a particular penalty regime, that period will be excluded. Then there's a selection in regard to the payment of preliminaries, any adjustment to the preliminaries. Those are all technical things that the technical agents generally discuss and agree on. Then section E deals with the form of tender. There the tenderer will provide its details. The acceptance of the tender conditions are set out there, and the tender amount compilation, so how the tender amount is put together. And lastly, there's a table that puts that the details of the tender qualifications can be provided for. So as I've mentioned, there's also a comprehensive set of certificates that can be used by the parties for purposes of administering the project and the contracts. And all these documents may not be applicable to all the contracts, all the suits of contracts, but waiver of lien is generally applicable, and the parties often sign the waiver of lien. I'm not going to go through all of them, but these are the standard forms that can be issued by the principal agent if, for example, interim completion is achieved or practical completion is achieved. The recovery statement is a very important document that's also used by the parties. The payment certificate and the way that the parties certify payment is also crucial for purposes of avoiding a dispute. And just to mention, the recovery statement is a document that will generally be attached to a payment certificate. And I think we'll go into more detail about regarding those documents in tomorrow's discussion. But in the recovery statement, it would set out the amounts that the employer and the contractor respectively would be entitled to, and that then should translate back to the payment certificate and the amount that's finally certified. The same documents would then apply to the nominated or selected subcontractors agreement. There's also template forms of the guarantee for construction. Those can generally be amended subject to what the requirements are between the parties. It depends on whether it should be an on-demand guarantee or just a surety. But I guess that's a topic for another day. Yeah, and then the JBCC adjudication rules, standard rules are also available if the parties agree to use those rules for purposes of resolution of the dispute. Okay, and then we'll move on to the common standard form of contract risk allocation.
Sorry guys, just give me 1 second. I just want to finish the chat. Okay, so first we'll just do a general overview of what risks you often find within the construction market. So the major risks that's most common to almost all projects are the following. It's environmental concerns, financial requirements, costs, quantity measures, design errors and emissions, defects, lack of access, delays, additional work or services, productivity issues, force majeure, and then geotechnical conditions. So those are the things that we often see come up. But looking at what's currently happening in Africa, I think it's important that we just run through issues that we see being very dominant within the African continent at the moment. So currently, or at the end of 2022, I think this statistics was 2022, there was more than 570 construction projects within Africa, more than $450 billion. So obviously, a lot of opportunity for construction within Africa. So the major power and infrastructure projects were found in Nigeria, Ethiopia, Kenya, Congo, and Senegal. And then South Africa obviously has got its REAP program, which is the Renewable Energy Project program. And this has led to various renewable energy projects within the country. Obviously by private companies who then conclude contracts with Eskom to put their power on the grid. So the power and the utility projects completely dominate the market at the moment. This is for onshore renewables, fossil power stations, and then combined cycle gas turbines. Second highest is commercial buildings being built. Unfortunately, the continent has experienced very high inflation, especially in relation to construction materials and the cost of that. We've seen enormous increases in material costs over the past 2 to 3 years specifically. There's obviously a lot of political instability, great concerns about public safety and insurgencies across the continent. And then during the COVID pandemic, Africa's construction sector was hit harder than most. And the continent's recovering construction industry faces strong inflation. The programs are susceptible to long project program overruns, longer than in most regions. And so there's probably 83% of planned schedules on average has got an overrun. So these issues we already found before COVID-19, but then once we hit COVID-19, there were restrictions on site access. And that kind of remained the leading cause of claims and disputes in Africa for a period. So the problem can be alleviated through better integration of the parties' operational practices and approvals for site-based working. And I think for the most part, the COVID-19 issues have now been dealt with and probably won't be as pertinent in 2023 as it still was last year. Cash flow is a major concern, and mostly that comes from payment problems. Employers who are very slow to pay contractors, contractors who are very slow to pay subcontractors. It can be because the approval procedures are overly bureaucratic. It can be because the contract management teams just do not have the capacity or does not have the experience that's necessary to properly manage these contracts. And so project leaders really need to promote transparency from procurement straight through to the claims management, strengthening governance processes, contract administration, and just put procedures in place generally that would move to combat corruption. Often there are these processes in place, but either they're not understood and they're not followed, and so they're not enforced. And then finally, we've obviously seen a surge in fuel prices as well, and more specifically in South Africa, as of late, we've also seen issues with defaults. So that's what's kind of happening in Africa at the moment. And if you do construction work in Africa, you need to be aware of the prevailing risks because you need to allocate those risks appropriately. And if you're dealing with claims, you need to understand the market in order to consider everything to advise on the claims. So moving specifically to South Africa, in 2022, $45 billion was allocated to infrastructure development. We saw government issuing what's called the National Infrastructure Plan 2050. And it's got great objectives with projects in energy, water, transport, telecommunications. But for some years now, we have just not seen any proper investment from government in line with this plan for major infrastructure projects. So we've started seeing new tenders go out for major infrastructure projects, but the processes are just full of problems. A prevailing issue is government issuing tenders that's not awarded for a year, 2 years, or ultimately cancelled after a year or a number of months, and either not reissued or reissued with exactly the same issues. And so there's just no government spend as there should be in terms of this national infrastructure plan. We're seeing a lot of tender review applications and massive delays, as I've said, in actually appointing bidders and getting construction work started. So all of this is obviously placing a massive risk on the construction industry as a whole. It's leading to very low profit margins. It's been the downfall of major construction companies, even more so small construction companies. And so there are really a lot of risks at play within South Africa that need to be looked at. Some of the things not mentioned on the slide is the fact that South Africa has so many strikes, both national strikes and illegal strikes. As I've said, we've got the construction mafia causing major delays, and that has even caused some major infrastructure projects to collapse, ending in termination of contracts, violence. We've got security issues, looting problems. If you just take as an example the PRASA railway line, which was all but built just before COVID hit and has now been looted to the extent that it's a fresh start to the project. There's just nothing left of what was done prior to COVID. These are the types of risks that you need to be very aware of when you're drafting contracts in South Africa, because allocating those risks is key. We've seen that standard FIDIC, standard NEC just does not always go the way to properly allocate these types of very specific jurisdictional risks. And we also know that not dealing with the risks is worse than actually dealing with it and allocating it properly and placing obligations on either the employer or the contractor as appropriate. So fair allocation of risk in contracts is imperative to a successful project, especially in a volatile market such as Africa, specifically South Africa. We're also seeing massive delays on materials, equipment, plant being imported because there's been a collapse at the harbours. And we're facing so many difficulties with things like load shedding that's really unique to South Africa at the moment, and that needs to be provided for. So a fair allocation significantly influences the behavior of the contracting parties. It impacts the project's performance, it impacts the final costs. And the key is to allocate risk to the party who's best placed to control that specific risk, and not simply to say, I just don't want the risk. An employer should be reasonable and realistic about the types of risks that fall within their control, and they should take those risks on. And similarly, a contractor should, where some risk is placed on it, should properly price for that risk. And in order to do that, it should understand the risk within the specific market. And then a fair allocation has an effect on, as we said, the cost of the project, the construction methods that needs to be employed, and just as a whole, the efficiency of the construction process. Okay, so dealing generally with how risks are allocated in the standard forms, I'm going to use the 99 suite as an example, and it's not necessary for me to go through all of this. You can just read it. But safe to say that within FIDIC there is very specific clauses that deals with risks and how risks are allocated. And so the very first thing you need to look at is, what are the employer's risks? And that is set out under the yellow and red books under clause 17.3. So there you'll have a whole list of things that typically form part of the employer risks. And those are the things that, if a delay is caused, a contractor might have an entitlement to claim money or time for those risks. And then similarly, in clause 4.1 of both of these books, you'll find, or actually all of the books, you'll find a similar list of what the contractor's general obligations are. Now, these two clauses are not exclusive, and throughout the contract, and we'll deal with that a little bit later, there are various specific issues where a specific risk is allocated either to the contractor, the employer, or shared risk. But these are the clause 4.1 and 17.3 are your main ones that you go to as a first port of call. In terms of FIDIC Silver, those are also set out in 17.3, but you'll find that it's a much shorter list of employers' risks. And then under gold, you've got a split. You've got employers and contractors risks during the design build phase. And then once that's completed and you move into the operation service period, there's different employers contractors risks set out there, and all of those are in clause 17. And then under FIDIC Green, they don't speak about employers risks. It's a list of employers liabilities, and it's set out in clause 6. So under the 2017 suite, there's no specific risk clause as you have for the employer as you have above. So the employer's risks was completely removed so that the concept of employer's risk is understood in the wider sense. And the 2017 book really tried to emphasize a fair allocation of risk. So the basic principles of what's underpinned the change is, where a party seeks to place risks on another party, where such a party clearly cannot carry the risks, it's just setting the project up for failure and that party up for failure. We all know that construction projects inherently have risks. They cannot be avoided. So they should be either rather properly allocated through the contract mechanisms. And of course, some risks can be shared, but other risks will fall solely on a certain party. And so there's really no right or wrong way to allocate risks. It just needs to be done and dictated by the market where the particular project is situated, by the economic factors, the type of the project, and a list of other considerations. So the key is just for the parties to be really realistic in terms of where the particular jurisdiction is. And that's what the 2017 version of FIDIC tried to get closer to. So the basic principles of risk allocation remain the same in the 2017 suite. The contractor is best suited to deal with risks that's associated with works planning and execution, with provision of labor, with materials and construction equipment, and for safety and site operations, whereas the employer needs to assume the risk of providing the site and any information that he has collected about the site, ensuring that it's available to the contractor to carry out the work, extra costs incurred by the contractor due to the occurrence of unforeseeable risks. And then design risks are borne by the party that's responsible for providing the design. So risk allocation then has certain consequences for certain events. And it's likely that those consequences will adversely affect the party's ability to deliver the project to specification on time and within the budget. So the risk is pre-allocated so that where the employer assumes responsibility, the contractor is contractually entitled to an extension to the time or to an increase in the contract price. Whereas where the responsibility for a particular risk is allocated to the contractor, the occurrence of the risk would not generate an entitlement to additional time or money to complete the works. Again, under the FIDIC 99 suite, under 17.4, it sets out what is the consequences for employer's risk, and that is what we'll talk about tomorrow, a claim by the contractor for additional time and cost, and it refers you to the processes that need to be followed for a contractor to claim that. It does not come automatically, it has to be claimed. All right, then we're just going to look at some of the more important specific risks and where they are allocated in terms of FIDIC. So under the 99 version, the red book, the yellow book, the silver book, much of it is very similar and in the same clauses. So important to note is what are outside of 17.3, what are the specific employer risks? That includes access to site. So the employer has to give the contractor access to site in a timely manner in order for the contractor to meet the activity schedule that it's got in its program. Unforeseeable physical conditions is an employer risk, except it's not an employer risk in the silver book, because that's something that's allocated, an obligation that's allocated to the contractor. Delays caused by authorities, a prolonged suspension of the works, and that's where the employer notifies a suspension to the works. Variations. So variations just broadly means there's a change to work. Either there's an increase in quantities, there's additional work, there's different materials that need to be used that might be more costly, things like that. And changes in legislation. That's all very specifically allocated to an employer. Risks that are specifically allocated to a contractor includes its subcontractors. So a contractor is responsible for its own subcontractors and whatever delays or underperformances the subcontractors have. It's responsible for safety of the site, of the works, quality assurance, transportation of goods, security, and this is very important, especially within the South African market, because we've seen construction mafia coming onto site, intimidating people, threatening people, and in some instances even shooting people. And so it's becoming increasingly difficult for a contractor to take on what was once just a normal obligation of security for the site. Because although a contractor knows in certain areas a project, and for certain projects, there's a great likelihood that the construction mafia might disrupt the site and come onto site and put security at risk. It also doesn't necessarily have the resources or the ability to control that and to properly take on that risk. And so often when it comes to something like construction mafia and security concerns around that, you might see that it becomes more of a shared risk than a specific contractor's risk. And certain procedures are put in place, certain requirements for security personnel or for community liaison, things like that might become really important. And then remedial works is a contractor's risk and test on completion. Shared risks include permits, licenses, and approvals, IP, insurances, and typically force majeure. So there's typically a split for force majeure. You might get time, but not cost. And so force majeure seeks to have a balanced risk allocation. In terms of the yellow book, a specific risk allocated to the contractor is design error, because it's obliged to provide the design. And then the differences that we find in the silver book is that unforeseen difficulties is not an employer's risk, it becomes a contractor risk. The design responsibility is moved over to the contractor, and then complying with laws, technical standards, and other requirements becomes a contractor risk, but changes to laws or regulations is still an employer's risk. Okay, in terms of the Green Book, we've got a set list of employer's liabilities in clause 6, as I said, and then you also have variations as an employer risk under clause 10. The contractor risks, again, it's subcontractors, design, safety, quality assurance, remedial works, and then insurances is a contractor's risk under the Green Book. Shared risk is actually access to site, so that's not just an employer's risk. Permits and licenses, inspection and testing, and force majeure. So what's changed between the 99 versions and the 2017? The risk allocation remained largely unchanged, but we have key elements of changes from the 99 to 2017 version. And I'm just going to take you quickly through those. So we've got a more defined risk regime, including the fact that the employer's risk had been taken out, and it's now more widely interpreted under the contract in various clauses. So the adoption of a more wide-ranging understanding of construction risk is in 2017, as we discussed. FIDIC has sought to enhance the fair and balanced nature of the 2017 clause by introducing a greater degree of reciprocity in obligations of each party in relation to matters such as confidentiality, compliance with law, recruitment, changes in law, termination, and most importantly, claims, which we'll look at tomorrow. There is an increased risk of assumption by the contractor as well, and so, kind of trying to get that a more balanced approach. Exceptional events were added. So instead of referring to a force majeure clause, it's now exceptional events. And so some people feel that the change in terminology is useful, as it avoids the confusion that's sometimes created where force majeure is defined as law in certain jurisdictions. So while there's no real change to the meaning of the clause, what is of interest from a South African point of view is that the approach in the new FIDIC towards strike and lockout, so that change is very important because it appears as a separate event now within the new definition of exceptional events, rather than having it in the broader category of riot, disorder, and all of the others, as it was previously. So strikes and lockouts, as we said, is common in South Africa. And more than anything else, FIDIC's separate categorization of this risk serves as a reminder that it needs to be carefully considered within a South African context and specifically allocated. Specifically, employers and contractors should bear in mind the trade union dynamics in South Africa, where strikes are sometimes initiated by unions rather than their individual employees. So there was a case in South Africa involving the 1999 version where a union-initiated strike occurred and the employer claimed that the contractor's employees had been involved. The contractor in turn said it wasn't the employees that were involved by choice, but because of their membership of the union, which had initiated the strike. So you can just think what type of dispute arose there and the amount of time and effort spent on properly interpreting the clause, the very wide clause of the 99 version. So the potential for this type of dispute is still present under the new 2017 terms, although riots and commotion on the one hand and strike and lockout on the other are now very specific, separate categories. But there's still a gap for you to or a gap for an employer, an opportunistic employer, or a contractor to cherry pick what category it considers best suited to its argument because of the fact that it's not yet properly defined. So, if anything, that's one of the things that you can consider if you're drafting for a South African market, is to properly define what the difference is between the two. And the best way to overcome this kind of ambiguity is for the parties to amend the standard wording, add a proper definition that's clear, unequivocally spelled out, so that they know it can be no room for argument at a later stage. Then there's a fitness for purpose clause that was specifically introduced. And fitness for purpose is now defined by reference to the purpose set out in the employer's requirements. Previously, this was by reference to the contract as a whole. So defining the fitness for purpose by reference to the employer's requirements narrows the scope, and it properly deals with, or it's properly dealt with in terms of the employer's requirements, which should provide greater certainty to the contractor and the employer alike. So the new fitness for purpose test is more specific than the previous one. And this can be seen as a positive development in terms of having greater certainty. So both the employer and the contractor will want to avoid any uncertainty of what an ordinary purpose means. And no doubt, this will encourage greater focus on ensuring that the purpose is clearly and accurately described in the employer's requirements. So again, as I've said, the employer's requirements is quite an important document, despite often being overlooked. It's worth highlighting that FIDIC's new fitness for purpose obligation is backed up by both an indemnity from the contractor and by a requirement to place professional indemnity insurance covering any liabilities arising from a failure to achieve the fitness for purpose obligation. We don't yet know whether this new insurance requirement is viable given the limitations that we commonly see in the insurance markets, but it is to be tested. So the express fitness for purpose obligations is now backed by strict obligations on the contractor, and it's really to ensure that the design of the work complies with the right standards and requirements that is important to the employer. Then we have a design indemnity that's been included in subclause 17.4. This is now fault-based. It's subject to a limitation, a cap, and consequential losses are excluded for that. And then lastly, we've already talked about the exceptional events. That's just a duplication. All right. So that's the allocation of risks. Okay, in terms of NEC 3 and 4, I'm not going to spend too much time on it because the NEC is quite straightforward. So you'll find the employer's risks in clause 8 or 80, as it is in NEC 3, and then all other things basically falls on the contractors. So in terms of NEC 4, it's the same. It's also under 80 and 81, except it doesn't refer to risks, but it refers to liabilities. And there's been some changes to the list of the employer's liabilities, but not that much. So that's it for the NEC.
Before we move on to the risk allocation on the JBCC, we just propose a 10-minute comfort break, and then we'll be back. So we're back. I hope everyone else is ready for us to continue. Okay, so we'll then continue with the risk allocation in relation to the JBCC Principal Building Agreement. Obviously, the same principles apply in terms of risk allocation as we have discussed. Ultimately, as Lisa Marie already highlighted, is that if there is a risk that's allocated to a particular party, that risk needs to be properly managed. And if it's not properly managed, then there are consequences that flow from that, and that will be a breach in terms of the contract. But yeah, we'll discuss the consequences of a breach under the contract during tomorrow's session. For now, we'll look at the risk allocation in terms of specific obligations under the JBCC Principal Building Agreement. So we've set out a table here in the slides with all the obligations under the contract and where the risk is allocated, but I might not go through all of them for purposes of this discussion today. But let's start firstly with law, regulations, and notices. So both parties, the employer and the contractor, are required to comply with law, and generally there's, from our experience, a schedule, or the parties will agree to particular consent or permits or licenses that might be applicable to a specific project that will either be procured by the employer, as the employer might be better allocated to procure those permits or licenses. For example, where the employer is the owner of land and that land needs specific licenses or permits in order for the construction works to be performed, the employer would be the party that's best allocated to procure those licenses. In other instances, the contractor is best allocated to maintain the license or the permit. But like I said, it all depends on the specifics of the project, and that will be negotiated between the parties at the relevant time. And the next one I'll look at is the design responsibility, because that's generally an obligation that differs between the different standard construction contract regimes. So under the JBCC Principal Building Agreement, the design responsibility is allocated to the contractor and to coordinate the design elements. But then at the same time, that is specific to the JBCC Principal Building Agreement, is that any design responsibility that is undertaken by a subcontractor shall be ceded to the employer. So in that instance, the responsibility lies with the employer, not with the contractor. The only obligation that the contractor has in terms of the subcontractor's designs is to ensure that it's timelessly submitted to the employer for acceptance, or to their principal agent. Otherwise, that responsibility or any defaults that arise from their designs lies between the employer and the subcontractor. The next obligation we'll look at is works risks. Work risk lies with the contractor from the moment that the contractor is provided with access or possession to the site up to the date that the certificate of practical completion is issued. The contractor is in possession of the site and is best placed to manage the risks that relates to the work. So therefore, that is a contractor risk. Then exclusions to the general contractor risk of liability include events such as the force majeure, use of works by the employer, any acts or omissions by a direct contractor in design of the works. So irrespective of the general obligation, there are some exclusions to that. Then insurances, as I've mentioned when we went through the contract data, insurances are also generally a shared risk. It will be identified which party is required to procure and maintain the insurance for the duration of the project. And yeah, so that's why, well, I guess it's not really a shared risk. It's actually a risk or obligation that lies both with the employer and the contractor. And where one of the parties failed to effect the required insurances, for example, where the employer fails in certain instances to procure the insurance that's required, the contractor then has a right to suspend the works. The next obligation that we'll consider is securities, and securities under the JBCC principle building agreement that are relevant relates to the performance guarantees or construction guarantees as it's referred to in this contract, and then the advance payment guarantee and the payment guarantee. So the obligation is on the contractor or the risk in relation to the guarantee for construction. So the reason why that is a risk on the contractor is because if there's any failure to perform the works, the employer would be entitled to rely on that security to remedy the breach by the contractor. There's also generally a requirement, and it's also specific in this contract, that if the contractor fails to provide or maintain the bond or the guarantee for the duration of the project, and the guarantee is about to expire, the employer is also entitled to rely on that, to call on that guarantee. If there's a guarantee for payment that's applicable to the project, where the employer guarantees to make payment for any monies that are due for the performance of the contractor works, that is obviously a risk that then lies with the employer, and the employer needs to ensure that that security is in place as the terms of the contract. If it fails to do so, then the contractor will also have a right to suspend performance of the works. So the next obligation we'll consider is setting out. That's clause 13.2. There, the contractor is, that's a contractor risk, because the contractor is responsible to set out the works, notwithstanding that the employer might provide some information about the site allocation. The preservation and the reinstatement of boundary pegs, beacons, and other survey information that were distributed or replaced by such items shall not deviate from that allocation of risk as it is drafted under the terms of this contract. Then nominated subcontractors, any payments to nominated subcontractors lies with the contractor. The contractor will pay the subcontractor the amounts that the principal agent certifies to be due in accordance with the subcontractor, and the same with the selected subcontractors. Direct contractors, however, the obligation lies with the employer, because that subcontractor is directly appointed and by the employer. Then the obligation in relation, or risk in relation to contract instructions, lies with the contractor, because the contractor is always obliged to perform any instructions that are issued by the principal agent. Any failure by the contractor to perform those instructions will then result in a breach of the contract. And then we can look at the practical completion regime. That's also a contractor risk. As we discussed, the JBCC contract provides for a regime where there's a date by which practical completion needs to be achieved, which means the work should be ready for the intended purposes. And if it fails to achieve that date, then the contractor is in breach and will be liable for penalties. The defects liability period provisions, it's clause 21. That is also a risk that falls on the contractor. And the reason for that is because the contractor needs to remedy any defects during the defects liability period. And if the principal agent instructs the contractor to remedy those defects, it's obliged to perform that. Otherwise, the employer might be in a position to appoint any other contractors to remedy the defects and recover the loss from the contractor. And then we can look at the revision of the date of practical completion. That's in clause, it's dealt with in clause 23, where there are events that entitles the contractor to revision of the date of practical completion without an adjustment to the contract value. And those events are generally the adverse weather conditions, inability to obtain materials and goods where the contractor has taken reasonable steps to avoid or reduce a delay, late supply of prime cost amount items, where the contractor has taken reasonable steps to avoid or reduce a delay, force majeure. So those are all events that are shared between the employer and the contractor. And the reason for that is that both parties have to accept some form of a risk, because in terms of the entitlement, the contractor will be entitled to extension of time, but not necessarily the cost. So both parties needs to accept some form of a loss in relation to those events. Then clause 23.2 and 23.3 relates to events that entitles the contractor to a revision of date of practical completion and an adjustment to the contract value. So those are events where the employer is best placed to manage the risk, and that if those events occur, the contract is entitled to extension of time and costs. Those are delayed possession of the site, making good physical loss, and repairing damage to the works where the contractor is not at risk. Contract instructions not occasioned by the contractor's default, such as what we would normally refer to as variations. Late or incorrect issue of construction information that's required by the contractor for performance of the work. And then the next liability deals with the penalty of late completion. We've touched on that already. So that's a contractor risk, because the contractor is obliged to manage the risk of achieving time for completion as agreed, or the practical completion date. Apology. Okay, and then that brings us to the end of the risk allocation under the JBCC Principal Building Agreement. I think we can move on then to consider some of the risk allocation under the operation and maintenance agreements. Although these are not standard forms of contract, this is just from experience what we normally see in terms of the allocation of risks under operation and maintenance agreements. So it is first and foremost very, very important for the operator and the employer to agree on the scope of services. And that is a risk that lies with the operator to ensure that services are performed to the extent that it is agreed with the employer or the owner. Obviously, if there are any variations to the services, that will become an owner's risk, because there will be cost consequences that flow from a variation. Then performance warranties. That is it's actually both an owner and operator risk. And the reason for that is because if there's a performance shortfall by the contractor, firstly, the contractor will be liable for penalties, because let me take a step back. As I've said in the introduction, operation and maintenance agreements are often used in the renewable energy space. So if there's an obligation, usually under the power purchase agreements, there is a particular level of energy that needs to be generated. And that obligation flows through to the EPC construction contract. And during the operation and maintenance phase, the operator also needs to achieve those performance guarantees. So that's a risk that lies with the operator. If it fails to achieve those guaranteed performances, it will be liable to penalties. And then sometimes you find a regime where there's an incentive where it can be entitled to a bonus payment if it achieves this particular level of the performance guarantees. Similarly, it's also an owner's risk, because under the power purchase agreement, if the owner does not produce the levels of energy that it agreed to provide under the power purchase agreement, it will also be liable to penalties. But that is obviously a risk that lies under the upstream agreement and not under the O&M agreement itself. Spare parts and spare part warranties. So it is an obligation of the operator to provide spare parts in order to perform the operation and maintenance during scheduled and unscheduled outages. And it's obviously then also required to ensure that there are a particular level of spare parts available, and to ensure that those levels are maintained throughout the operation and maintenance period or term, to ensure that if there is an outage, those spare parts are available as and when necessary. Another obligation is specifically the spare part warranties. It happens in some of the O&M agreements that it's agreed that the warranty won't necessarily lie with the operator itself, but with the O&M, and the O&M warranties will then be ceded to the operator to manage on behalf of the owner. So which simply means that if there's a spare part that needs to be remedied or replaced, it can rely on those warranties to replace the spare parts. And then there's also an interface and cooperation obligation that lies on the operator. During the operation and maintenance term, there would generally be other contractors on site, and the operator will, specifically for the first, depending on the nature of the project, but on big renewable energy projects, there would typically be a period of 1 or 2 years where the operation and maintenance operator and the EPC contractor are both on site, and therefore there's this interface and cooperation obligation that lies on the operator to ensure that there are no delays or disruptions on the project. Unforeseeable events, that's also shared risks, same as that we've discussed on the JBCC principal building agreement, and that you would find in any other contract where there's an event that's not foreseeable by the parties and not really within the control of any of the parties. That's generally a risk that will be shared between the parties, such as a force majeure event. Changes to the project that we've touched on, it's a variation to the scope of work. That is owner obligation or risk, because as I've said before, that will result in additional costs that needs to be paid by the owner. Change in law, that's a shared risk. The operator is generally unlikely to agree to accept a change in law risk that it could not reasonably foresee, as it is a risk that it cannot control and is likely to have an adverse impact on its ability to perform the services or its financial return from the project. But generally, from our experience, that is agreed as a shared risk, because it's also not something that the employer or the owner can control. The suspension right that the contractor's got is a risk that needs to be managed by the owner. You can imagine the moment that the operator suspends performance of operation and maintenance services, it means that the facility is not operated, and it will definitely have a direct impact on the revenues that will be on the revenues of the project. So that's definitely a risk that needs to be managed by the owner. Okay, and that brings us to the end of risk allocations under the standard forms of contracts that you generally find in the renewable energy sector. So we'll move on to look at the employer's agents under the different contracts. Generally, the principle behind employer's agent is just it's someone that is nominated as a representative on behalf of the employer and has certain rights and obligations to perform on behalf of the employer. But those obligations and authorities look different under this different contracts, and we'll have a look at that. Okay, so firstly, we'll look at the JBCC. The agent there is referred to as the principal agent, and that is the entity that is nominated in the contract data, as we've looked at a moment ago. And then you also have the agent, which can, in some events, have authority that relates to specifics of the scope of work. So the principal agent typically are responsible and authorized to certify payment certificates in respect of works that have been performed, to determine claims and issue instructions. Where the principal agent fails to act or is unable to act or ceases to be a principal agent, the employer must then appoint a new principal agent, and the contractor generally have a right to object on reasonable grounds if it feels the nominated principal agent is not suitable for any specific reason. Another important point is that the employer must not interfere with or prevent the principal agent from exercising a fair and reasonable judgment when performing their obligations. Because the point is that specifically where it performs its obligation to certify payments, it needs to act as an independent party and not be influenced by the employer's views or comments, at least not persuaded by that. Okay, then we'll look at the FIDIC red and yellow specifically. There, the engineer is what is called the person that is authorized to act and perform obligations under the contract on behalf of the employer. The engineer is defined there to mean the person that is appointed by the employer to act as the engineer for the purposes of the contract and named in the appendix to tender, or other person appointed from time to time by the employer. So yeah, as I said, the engineer acts to perform duties assigned to him by the employer. Again, typically, the engineer's most important administrative duties are communication exchanges, notifications, certifying payments to the contractor, to issue instructions, and to make determinations of claims. If the engineer is a legal entity, it must then appoint a natural person on its behalf, and the details of that person would be reflected in the contract data. As we now just discussed under the JBCC Principal Building Agreement, the engineer can also be replaced if it becomes unavailable to act as an engineer, and the contractor also have a right to object to the appointment of an engineer on reasonable grounds. And then the specific duties and authorities that the engineer has as set out in the contract itself are that the engineer must act as a skilled professional. It has no authority to amend the contract. Authority attributable to the engineer as specified in or necessary to be implied from the contract. There's no requirement for the engineer to obtain the employer's consent before the engineer exercises its authority in respect of the determinations of disputes. And any performance by the engineer's representative, or any assistant shall not relieve the contractor from any duty or obligation that it needs to perform in connection with the contract. So the FIDIC green is very similar, but in some instances a bit different. Again, here the employer appoints an engineer to perform duties and authorities that is set out in the contract itself. I'm not going to repeat because, like I said, the provisions are more or less the same. Yeah, we'll go through that. Okay, so the one difference here is that the Green Book actually states that if the engineer is required to obtain any consent from the employer before exercising any authority, those requirements must be mentioned in the contract date, and the employer may not impose further constraints on the engineer's authority. So the employer will be deemed to have consented when the engineer exercises such specified authority. The engineer also don't have the authority to amend the contract or relieve either party of any duty of obligations, except as otherwise stated in the conditions. Then we can just look at the effects of an Engineers Act in clause 3.4. The engineer or its authorized person's acceptance agreement, approval check, certificate shall not relieve the contractor from any of its duties. So what is very important from these contracts are the fact that irrespective of the performance of the engineer's duties and obligations under the contract, the contractor remains obliged to perform in terms of its obligations under the contract and cannot use the engineer's performance as an excuse for its own failure to perform. Okay, then we'll move on to FedEx Silver. So the difference that I would like to highlight under the FedEx Silver is that there's a employee's representative. There's no reference to an engineer in the FedEx Silver, and but the duties remain more or less the same than under the other FedEx contracts we just discussed. And what is also important to note in relation to the employee's representative's authority is that it doesn't have the authority to terminate the contract in terms of clause 15. So that is specifically excluded from its authority. Then NEC 3 and NEC 4, there it refers to the product manager or the service, the supervisor. That is then the person that is appointed by the employer to act in terms on behalf of the employer under the NEC 3 and 4. Again, same obligation on the contractor to provide or to perform its obligations under the contract, irrespective of any performance by the project manager and the supervisor. The project manager and the supervisor may, if it gives notice to the contractor, delegate some of their actions or authorities. But that, like I said, needs to be notified to the contractor. A project manager may give an instruction to the contractor which changes the works information or a key date. And under the NEC, the employer may also replace the project manager or the supervisor after giving notice to the contractor. Yeah, so that brings us to the end of this topic. I think now we can proceed with any questions and answers.
Okay, so Betty, I think if no one has questions, then we can end today's session here. Just a reminder, tomorrow we'll do the claims processes under the different contracts. So that includes your contractor claims process, employer's claim process, and the determination. And then we'll do a general overview of what alternative dispute resolution mechanisms are available. We will then discuss the dispute avoidance mechanism, which is new in the market in terms of FIDIC 2017 and NEC 4. And we'll then close off the session with the dispute resolution mechanisms under the standard form contracts. Okay, well, everyone, have a great day. We'll see you tomorrow.